today's session, I'm going to spend some time talking about gear and what sort of gear I like to use in the waves and the reasons why. And the reason why I think this is really important to share this with you is while you're progressing your riding and you are taking it to the next level, there's a lot of intricate details that you need to consider with your gear. So I'm hoping just to share my knowledge with you guys. So when you are looking for your next surfboard or your next kite or whatever it is, you understand what you're looking for. So then you can, you'll be in a better position to make a good decision for yourself, okay? So before I get started, one thing I want to point out is I'm absolutely not here to plug our gear and say, hey, you need our gear. However, we do make gear specific for surf. And there's a lot of things that we, like a lot of points of differences that we really try to put into our product to showcase this and to make the product as good as it can be for in the waves. But at no point in this session is it about ramming our gear down your throat. Like I said, my ultimate goal is for you guys to walk away from this with a little bit more knowledge on all the differences in the gear so you can make a good decision moving forward into the future, okay? So first thing today I'm going to start with are our surfboards. I love talking about surfboards because there's so many different shapes and sizes and so many fun, intricate details to consider when getting a new board. And for me, there's nothing better than getting a new board. So it's cool to talk about it and hopefully share a little bit of my knowledge with you guys in terms of what's going to be best to pick for you. So first of all, I'm going to start with the fins. There's a couple of points that I want to talk about that are really important that you understand about fins and what fins do, okay? So first thing is, fins give you direction, okay? Without fins on the bottom of your board would just be swirling all over the place and you would have no control. When you put fins into a board, it actually gives you direction in the direction that you want to go. Fins also create lift at the back of your board, okay? So when you get up and going, especially when you're paddling into a wave, when you start getting momentum going down the face of the wave, the back of the board will lift up and that's what helps you generate speed, okay? The other thing that fins do is they create drag, okay? So this is where it gets really important that you understand what fins are going to be best for you in terms of the conditions that you ride, whether you're riding very big waves, small waves, or something in between, okay? Basically, a board is designed for the water to flush out the tail or the back of the board, okay? So this middle fin here is really a fin that is a stabilizing fin, okay? But it also creates drag because that's where the water's pushing out. So like on this board, you can see here we've got a quad fin setup. So there's no trailing or middle fin or stabilizing fin here. So therefore the water is going to move more cleanly throughout the back of the board and it's going to have less drag, okay? There's a really big hype on quad fins at the moment and this is one of the most common questions I get asked about whether somebody should be using a thruster fin or quad fin setup. The first thing that I always say to people is it really comes down to personal preference and the conditions that you ride in. And also that both feel very different and they draw very different lines on the waves. So it's really what feels best for you also. But I'm going to point out a couple of things to consider with the differences in these fins so you can understand them in terms of making a decision moving forward in what you should use, okay? So we'll start with the quad fin setup. So as you can see here with the quad fin setup, if you slice the board in half directly down the middle of the board, you'll see that on either side of the board, on either side of the rail, you've got two fins to work with, okay? This is really good for when you're going upwind because you can lock these two fins in and you can point, I'm not gonna say a lot better upwind, but for me, I personally feel like I can at least go a little bit better upwind with having two fins to lock in on the side or on the rail that I'm using pointing in that direction. Okay, so that's one thing. Also too, when you have a wider tail on a board like this, you're not sharing the center fin when you're going from rail to rail. So you've actually got two fins to work off instead of sharing the center fin. So once again, with a wide tail like this, when you're doing turns, you can really lock in your rail on that particular side because you've got two fins to work with. The biggest difference I find between a quad fin setup and a thruster fin setup is that, once again, on a quad fin setup, the water rushes more cleanly out of the back of the board. So it feels like you have less drag and you can accelerate a lot quicker. For example, when you go to get up on a small mushy wave, having a quad fin setup is going to allow you to get up and generate speed a lot quicker because you're going to have less drag where the water's trying to flow through the back of the board. So typically what I use in small, junky, flat, mushy waves or light wind, I'll use a quad fin setup because it's not as restricting me as much and I feel like I can get up and go and move a lot quicker. The difference is, once you start getting in more critical sections of the wave or where you're trying to do big turns or vertical turns, I feel like I have less control with a quad fin setup, okay? Because you've got this space at the back of the board that becomes somewhat, slides around a little bit, or it basically is a little more unpredictable. Okay, so if you can imagine when you're doing a turn on the face of the wave, you haven't got this center fin to help guide you and give you direction and lock in. You've actually got a space at the back of your board with no fin that will potentially slide a little bit more. Okay, so overall, I would say a thruster fin setup is a little bit more predictable than a quad fin setup. However, you can use the unpredictability in a quad fin setup to your advantage in terms of when you're doing turns. Because of that unpredictability, you'll go up to do a turn, but because it's unpredictable, when you bust your fins out or you slide across the lip or even on the open face, it can make the turn flare a lot more than what you originally planned to do, which can be more exciting in your surfing. It's not the same particular thing every time. So I like that sensation with the quad fins. Once again, with the thruster setup, you've got the fin at the back of the board, so it's going to create more drag when you're going along, okay? Basically, I use, I'd say, this thruster setup 60% of the time. The reason why I like using a thruster fin setup is because, like I said before, they're more predictable. And during turns, especially in more critical turns on the waves, I feel more confident with this board because it's predictable and I understand what it's going to do next. So when I'm doing open face turns and more performance styles surfing or kite surfing, I typically use the thruster fin setup. So just to summarize that, quad fin setup, I use it more often than not when the waves are small and junky because I find it gets up and gets going quicker, and it's also faster down the line through flat mushy sections of the wave. Plus I like the sensation and the feeling of the lines that it draws on the face of the wave also. When the waves start getting a little bit bigger and they're more performance, I tend to go to a thruster fin setup because it's more predictable, okay? Then when the waves get really, really big, I'll go back to a quad fin setup. The reason why I do this is because as waves get bigger, you need to create less drag because you want to be able to go as fast as you possibly can. Okay, so with a quad fin setup or any big wave board setup, what we typically do is we set the fins so they're very straight in the direction that you want to go. And we do this by controlling the cant and the toe of the fins on the board. So they're all set very straight towards the nose of the board in the direction that you're going. However, when it's like this, it's much harder to turn your board because when you go to initiate a turn, your body will be going one way in a direction that you want to go, but because the fins are set so straight, it will keep going in the direction that you're already going in. So it's more for steering and with your fins set, with the cant and the toed set or the slice set very predominant out to the side, okay? So a couple of important things to consider there with your fins. One last thing also too is the size of the fins that you're using. Typically All fins come in a small, medium or large size, and this is really going to reflect the size of you as well, and also the size of the waves or the conditions that you're riding in. Typically when I'm kite surfing, I just use a medium fin because I don't need that acceleration when I'm first entering into the wave to get me up and going, because I've already got it from the kite. However, when I'm surfing in smaller waves, I'll use a little bit bigger of a fin so I can get up and go a little bit more. All right, so a couple of good things to consider when you're purchasing your next set of fins or looking at your next board. One other thing too, which I forgot to point out before, is it's really pretty much all the boards I get made these days, I get them made with a 5-fin setup. So I've got the options of running with 3 fins or 5 fins, and this is both for surfing and kiting, because it's really amazing how different a board will feel when you change the fin placement. And it's great, you know, to try and do different turns and feel what different lines are on the wave, and it really mixes it up. It keeps things fresh. I find a quad board, once again, a little bit more playful and unpredictable, so I like that, but also it's good to have the option if the waves do get a little bit steeper and hollower and more performance orientated, to just be able to change your fins. So, and a lot of boards these days or board shapers are doing that anyway, so I recommend that if you've got the opportunity also. Okay, next thing we're going to chat about is the rocker of the board. The rocker is the curve from the nose of the board all the way to the tail of the board. Simply put, the more rocker you have in your board, the more drag you're going to create in the water. Okay, the flatter your rocker is, the more planing and surface area your board will have in the water and the faster you'll go. However, when we're riding on a wave, especially a steep wave, when you're going down or dropping in on a wave, if you have no rocker at all in your board, what's going to happen? You're going to nosedive, okay? So you need to have some rocker in your board, but you need to find that fine line in terms of how much rocker you want to have in your board. And once again, that's going to be related to the conditions you most commonly kite in. For example, if you're kiting in very strong wind, in long, steep, hollow, fast waves, you're going to have lots of rocker to be able to perform in those waves. But if you're kiting in small, onshore, sloppy waves, you're going to have less rocker so you can maintain speed throughout those flat sections of the wave. Okay? So that's your rocker. Next thing is your width. How much area you have from one rail to the other rail. Basically, the less width you have, the more control you're going to have over your board, but the harder your board is going to be to ride, to get up and going, and also to move through flat, mushy sections of the wave. It's going to be more performance orientated. The wider you go, the more stable your board's going to be. So in terms of when you're going to stand up, I'm sure you've all tried it when you've gone from a long board to a short board. When you stand up on a long board, you have a lot of balance because you have less rocking in the board. But the narrower you go and the shorter you go with your board, the less control or the less balance you can have on that board. So remembering, the wider you go, the more control and more balance that you're going to have. But the narrower you go, the more performance orientated it's going to be. Once again, it's based on the conditions that you're riding and also your level and your ability. Typically, really good surfers or kite surfers will go a little bit narrower because they've got really good balance and they can control the board. But somebody who's just getting into it and just getting started, they're typically going to have a board a fair bit wider. Okay? Next thing is the volume of your board. So how thick your board is. The thicker your board is, the more it will float on top of the water. So once again, the easier it will be to ride. Okay? The thinner you go with your board, the more experienced you need to be. The difference is, the thinner you go, the more you can lock in your board and do long, big, critical turns, because the board will really sit in the water and it will allow you to go straight up and down in critical sections of the wave. The more volume you have, the more the board will sit on the water or the more the board will float on the water. So the less control you'll have over it in critical sections on the wave. Okay, next thing is the length of your board. And this is a really big one. This is what people struggle with a lot of the time. It's like, what size board is right for me? Once again, it's always going to be based on the most common conditions that you ride. I pretty much kite on exactly the same board that I surf on. I like to just have one quiver of boards, and ultimately I'm doing the same thing on a wave when I'm kiting as what I'm doing surfing. All I'm doing is I'm using the kite to whip me into the wave, and then once I get onto the wave, I'm trying to surf it like I would normally surf. So I always focus all the things that I've spoken about just now on what's going to work best in the waves, not so much what's going to work in terms of being able to go upwind, because any of these boards are going to go upwind because you've got length, you've got volume, you've got width, and all the right ingredients, you know, for it to be able to plane well. Of course, some will go upwind better than others, but the key focus here is the waves. So in terms of picking the right length for you guys, it's going to come down to, once again, the conditions that you ride in, but also your size and shape, okay? So basically this board that we're looking at here, I would call a standard shortboard shape, okay? So a standard shortboard is at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a fish style board or a retro board, which I'm sure you've all seen or all used at some point. And this board tends to be a lot shorter, fatter, wider, and it's basically more of a fun board to use. Then right in the middle of the shortboard and the fish style board, we have a board which is more of a hybrid style board. And basically what this board is, it's a board that's taken some of the ingredients out of a shortboard and some of the ingredients out of a fish board to make it a hybrid, okay? This is the most commonly used board these days because, let's face it, we mostly kite in average conditions, right? It's not like it's 6 to 8 foot and perfect every day. Okay, I would say I ride this board about 80% of the time. And I save a board like this board for when the conditions are good and I'm doing more performance style surfing or kite surfing. So in terms of the length of the board, what the difference is, the short board, which we just spoke about first, is always going to be a little bit bigger in size. The fish is going to be the smallest in size, and then the hybrid is going to sit right in the middle. Basically, the equation and how it works is that the wider you go, the more volume you have, the shorter you can go in length. Okay, because you're making up for going shorter in length with volume and wideness in your board. To coincide with that, the rocker is very important. So the flatter you go with your rocker, the smaller you can go with your board as well. So typically speaking, this sort of board, because it's got a flat rocker, it's nice and wide, especially through this area of the board. It's got a nice wide tail. This board is going to excel in flat mushy waves, and it's something that you can go upwind very nicely on and something that's going to perform in average conditions, okay? Whereas the other board, we need a little bit better waves for it to work, and it's going to be more performance orientated. So let's talk about a couple of examples with you guys in terms of your local conditions, and I'll give you a few tips on what sort of a board you would look at buying. So let's start with you, Grant. What's your typical kiting conditions at home in terms of wind strength and waves? So Grant's typical conditions are about 12 metre kite and not too many waves, pretty junky waves, and he's 6'1" in height. So for him, I'd be recommending definitely a hybrid board, okay? And 6'1" in height in terms of a short board. A short board for you would be around about a 6'3". I always recommend people going about 2 inches taller than what they are if they're using a performance short board, okay? But once you get better, you might keep it more even and it'll be around the same height as you. So once your ability gets higher and you being 6'1", you could then potentially be using a 6'1" short board. But for the beginning, I'd say somewhere around 6'3". However, I'd be recommending for your conditions a hybrid board. Now, once again, because a hybrid board has a little bit more width, a little bit more volume, and a flatter rocker, we can go shorter. Okay, so in terms of a hybrid board, 6'1", I'd be saying you could go somewhere from a 5'8" to a 6'0", depending on how wide you go and how much volume you have in the board. Okay? Yep. Okay, so good waves, but they're not breaking top to bottom. They're kind of just rolling more so. Yeah, okay. So the conditions that we're talking about here is decent sized waves, pretty decent wind, around 18 knots. So I would probably be going for you somewhere between a short board and a hybrid board. Maybe, you know, focusing on still having, you know, the main ingredients in the short board so you can still perform on the waves, but maybe having a little less rocker. So when you are on the sort of fat sections of the wave, that you can still, you know, still drive through that. What's your height? 5'9"? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so for you, you know, your short board, what is your short board at the moment for surfing? 5'9", yeah, perfect. So, you know, your ability levels is really good. So in terms of your height, you're sitting at 5'9", your short board's already 5'9", so I just keep that as is, but then maybe come in with a slightly less performance orientated hybrid board, maybe sitting around 5'7", something like that. Yep. So there's some examples in terms of, you know, what to pick for you. Last thing that I really want to point out with the surfboards, and I think this is a very, very important fact and something that I, you know, really encourage people to do, is make sure no matter what board that you get, it's shaped by a surfboard shaper. I see a lot these days, and I'm never about bagging, you know, other brands or, you know, what anybody does, but I think this is a very important thing that people need to know about surfboards, is that they have to be shaped by a surfboard shaper. I see a lot of kite brands now getting into the wave side of things because they see the push in it, and they've been shaping twin tips for 10 years and they're probably very good at it, but they don't have the experience to shape surfboards. But now they're shaping surfboards. Surfboard shapers have spent years and years refining their shapes, building their templates, getting their rockers down to a fine art. So it's really, really important that you maximize this and make sure that you're going to get a board that's going to work in the waves for you. So remember that, always check and make sure that board has been shaped by a surfboard shaper. So in terms of constructions, here we've got two pretty similar constructions, but quite different in a way. It's one of those things with surfboards where there's so many options in terms of how to build them, okay? But look at all good surfers these days, and they're all still riding a standard fiberglass board with a PU blank, okay? The reason why they're riding this is because these boards have the best feeling and the best flex. Flex is ultimately probably the most important thing in a board. It's the difference between having a board feel dead or alive when you're in the water, okay? When you start going down this road, where this isn't a full production board, but it is a mass-produced board, okay? What people are trying to achieve with mass-produced boards is they're trying to make them indestructible, okay? So they're putting a lot of material into these boards to make them stronger than a standard short board. But what happens when you start adding material or building boards out of a mold, or which we call pop-out boards, you start losing the flex in the board, you start gaining more weight. And what happens with these boards, yeah, they last a lot longer and some of them may be indestructible, but you're losing the sensation and the feel of when you're on the wave. And for me, and for almost everybody out there, that's the most important thing, is that you have a board that feels alive in the water. The difference between riding this board and say a full production board is you go out in a session and it will float and it will glide over the water and it will feel very nice to ride, it will feel alive. Whereas a pop-out board, They tend to sit more on top of the water. They have more buoyancy. So when you're doing turns or you're just going along, they're a lot more chattery, okay? And then they don't have that feeling. They have that dead feeling because there's no flex in the board. So there's a couple of things to consider there. I always say to people, you know, you treat your surfboard like you treat your girlfriend. You look after it. You know, it's like a piece of gold sitting in the back of your car. Don't leave it in the sun. Don't jump on it. Don't, you know, treat it badly in any way. There's a lot of time and effort put into building these things, and you know, when you get that epic day in the water and the waves are amazing, you want it to feel the best it can possibly feel, right? So I always look after my boards really well, and they last a long time. And I would always pick performance over construction. You know, there is a lot of, you know, in-betweens where you can get boards a little stronger, still keeping, you know, the surfboard sensation, but just remember, the more material you add to the board, the more it's going to stiffen it up and the more it's going to weigh, okay? So it's really, really important that you don't go over the top with that. I've taken a board like this and gone out and snapped it in my first session, or I've had it last for 2 years. I find with these boards, the more you ride them, the more stress you put on them. So even if a board doesn't snap or, you know, you haven't destroyed it, over a period of time, it will lose a bit of its flex and it will lose a bit of its feel. You know, however, it's just, I feel like most of the time when they do break is because the wave's broken them. When I'm riding or when I'm going upwind, I try to go very slow, and I try to not be very heavy on my feet going over the chops. That will definitely make your board last a lot longer, and it's more comfortable riding that way anyway. But when I'm on the wave, I never hold back. I always go for it, and if the wave, it's like surfing, if the wave ends up breaking your board, then, you know, it's just part of what we do. Yeah, typically in terms of fin sizes, with a thruster fin setup, the fins are always going to be the same size. But with a quad fin setup, your front fins are going to be larger than your trailing fins. It's just how the mechanics work. Yep. But in terms of the overall size of what to pick, you know, once again, it's really going to be based on the conditions and the size of the person. Typically, the bigger the person, the bigger the fins, the smaller the person, the smaller the fins. So next thing to chat about is the bar. Once again, for me, kiting in the waves, the most important thing is simplicity. I want to keep everything absolutely as simple as possible so I can focus on riding the wave and not have to worry about what my gear's doing. There's a couple of really important things to point out with a bar. First of all, lines. You want to have as thick lines as you possibly can. We make all our products with the thickest lines out there because when you're in the waves and you crash your kite, sometimes you have to grab your lines to be able to launch or relaunch your kite again. Also too, if you get yourself in the worst case scenario and you get yourself tangled in the lines, there's less chance that you're going to cut yourself with thicker lines. So it's really important that you consider that when you're riding in the waves. Next thing is to make sure that you don't have a whole lot of stuff going on in this area, like safeties and pulleys and all these things that you need to pull, because when you're looking at the wave, the wave that you're riding, you're always going to be looking through this. So you don't want a whole bunch of stuff that you have to look through that's going to put you off. We call our system here the clear view system, purely because we've only got the essentials there of what you need. Next thing is making sure that you have soft bar ends. When you fall off, you typically fall off and you fall onto your board. If you have hard bar ends, you're going to damage your board. Soft ones will give you a much better chance of not destroying your board. Also too, if your bar hits you, it's not going to hurt as much. Same with the grip, making sure that you have a very soft grip. We don't get epic days every day. So when the wind and the waves are on and it is good, you want to make the most of it. So sometimes you can be out there for hours. It's important that you have a soft grip So if you are out there for hours, it doesn't tear your hands up. Also too, with the soft grip and the floats, it's very important that your bar actually floats when it's in the water, because if you eject from your kite because you didn't want your kite to get destroyed in the waves and you have to swim after it, if your bar does not float, then you won't be able to see where it is. So it's really important that you have a bar that floats. In terms of the safety system and the chicken loop, once again, making sure that it's very simple. You need to have a good swivel on there, so when you're looping your kite or you're doing certain tricks, that you can untwist your center lines very easily. Somewhere nice to grab onto the bar if you're unhooking, okay? We've basically built this so it fits perfectly around your hand, which is also really important. And then your safety system, making sure that it's a good push away safety system, so if you do get yourself in a situation where you need to eject, it's easy to use. And then once again, as I showed you guys the other day, somewhere to hook on your leash if you want to ride in the suicide, basically ride set up suicide, so you don't have to kill your kite if you lose your kite, okay? So a couple of really important things to consider with your next bar purchase. The donk stick hooks onto here, okay? But I've taken it off on this bar because I don't use the donk stick. So it's something that you can, that's removable. So personal preference once again for somebody who doesn't want to use it.
Why don't you use it?
For me, it's just another thing that gets in the road. And like once your ability gets up there, you're never pulling back on your bar hard enough where it's going to pull it actually out of your spreader bar or your hook. So for me, I just don't like having the donk stick there, and I also like to unhook a lot. So when I'm unhooking, it's one less thing that can get in my road.
Unhook when you ride?
Yeah, when I'm riding the waves. Yep.
You always unhook?
Not always, just depending on the conditions. Yeah.
Why,
Yep.
what do you like? Just unhooking, holding it, and
Well, the reason why you unhook, and we're going to do a session on this with the kite position, the reason why I unhook or I like unhooking is because when you're hooked in to your harness here, you're pivoting and you're getting pulled off one point. So you're limited to what you can do. Once you unhook, you open up your whole body and you can move your arms around wherever you want to fit in with a particular turn that you're doing. So for me, it feels more natural in certain situations to be able to ride that way. It feels more like surfing.
arm,
Yes.
on the kite.
So no, yeah, you're just holding onto the kite, you're getting the kite in position where you want it to be, and then you're performing your turns on the wave. So for me, it feels the most like surfing. Okay, next thing we're going to chat about is kites. First of all, with kites, all the brands out there are making amazing kites at the moment. The technology for everybody is pretty similar. All kites depower very well, all kites go upwind very well, and all kites, you know, feel pretty similar. Obviously there's a lot of different shapes and sizes and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, they ultimately all do pretty much the same thing. However, when you're in the waves, there's a couple of very intricate details that you need to consider, and you need to make sure that your kite is going to perform. Okay, so a couple of things that I'm going to point out, and for me, the most important one is that you know where your kite is at all times. So you have a stable kite, and it doesn't matter where your kite is in the power zone, you can feel it and you know that it's there, okay? This is really good for people who are learning too. Our kites, although they are built specifically for the surf, our kites are in fact very, very good kites to learn on because they need to be user-friendly. Let's face it, when we're in the surf, all you want to focus on is riding the wave. You don't want to have to worry about what your kite's doing. So, somebody who's learning to kite, it's a great kite for them because the kite's very stable, it's sitting there and you don't have to worry about what it's doing. It's really, really important when you're on the waves. The next thing is how your kite turns throughout the power zone. It needs to have a clean, consistent turn no matter where it is in the power zone. This is very important because when you're riding on the wave and you are turning your kite, you don't want your kite to dictate what you do or pull you off the wave. So it's very important, no matter where your kite's turning throughout the power zone, that it pulls you cleanly and consistently so it doesn't, right in the middle of a turn, rip you out of position, okay? The final thing, and for me, the most important thing in terms of a good wave ride, is down the line drift. What I mean by down the line drift is that when you've sent your kite down the line and you're going in the same direction as your kite to ride the wave, that your kite drifts nicely with you down the line and it does not backstall. This is the most common thing that I see people trying to learn how to ride in the waves do, is have their kite backstall. It's essential, okay? So you need to make sure that when you're in that situation that your kite has good drift. I can tell straight away whether a kite's going to drift well or not just by putting tension on its back lines and seeing how it backstalls. We've designed our kite to make sure it flies off the front lines and also the back lines, so when you're going down the wave, you don't have that problem, okay? It's the worst thing to have happen to you is when you're on a nice wave and everything's good and you're heading in the direction that you want to go, but your kite keeps falling back into the wind window. Okay, so a couple of main things that you need to consider with your kite is the overall build of the kite. Absolutely making sure that it's built with the best possible materials. Also too, making sure that you've got scuff guards all in the right area, that you've got extra support with Dacron and stitching, and just make sure the overall build is built as good as it possibly can be. Another really important thing to consider is the length of your bridle. Basically, we've tried to make our bridle as short as possible, so when you do crash your kite in the waves, there's less chance of it flipping over and inverting itself within the bridle or it getting tangled. Also too, just little intricate things like when you're walking down the beach, if you have a really long bridle, it tends to pick up a lot of stuff on the beach. And once again, you know, one of our most critical things is making sure that the simplicity factor is taken into consideration, and the smaller bridle you have, the more simple it is. So just to summarize that, no kite is indestructible in the waves, but you need to make sure that your kite is built in the best possible way to give you the best chance of survival if you do crash your kite in the waves. Basically, the reason why we've got a pretty thick leading edge is so it holds the overall structure. Okay, so the thinner you go with your leading edge, then you have to start adding things like battens or a fifth line or something like this to be able to make it hold its structure. So when it's flying along, and also when it's in the water for water relaunch and all the rest of it, you want something that's going to sit there solid. Yeah, I haven't personally had that happen. So the question is, when you're kiting in colder conditions, does your kite potentially lose some air? And I believe so. Yeah, I've heard people say the same thing. Same when we leave our kites out here in the heat, everything expands and moves around. So I think on either end of the spectrum, cold or hot, it does mess with the kites to some degree. Yeah, so the question is, have we had one pop sitting on the beach on a hot day? Yes, we have. I've seen lots of kites, especially just down here, sitting on the beach and just pop, you know, because they just heat up so much and they've been pumped up really tight. In the beginning, I've seen all brands of kites do that. I don't recommend that you leave your kite sitting on the beach. We always do it because we're always testing new materials and we want to see how far we can push the limits of our product. But if you were here just kiting and it wasn't, you know, there was days where there wasn't wind, or you were leaving it on the beach throughout the whole day and not just the night, I'd seriously consider letting my kite down so it has more longevity. Yeah, I don't ever use the clips on the struts. Some people do.
Where are they there?
They're there for a number of reasons. One, so people can just roll their kites up and still keep the struts inflated, so it's a quicker pump, you know, maybe if they're going for another run or something like that. And then also too, for beginners, once again, you know, to keep the struts pumped up in the boat. Also when you're doing a boat launch, it's easier to have the struts pumped up, so you don't have to pump up as much in the boat as well. The other and the biggest reason why is if you do get a leak in your kite, it gives you the opportunity to close everything off and try and isolate the leak. So you go, okay, I know it's the leading edge, or I know it's that strut.
Or if you hit a bird.
Yeah, so
Basically, with a standard shortboard, they're going to be set at a certain degrees, and then the fins are going to be made that way as well, which is standard across the board. So you can't change the angle per se of just the normal fins. However, you can get fins that are more spliced out to the side, and I'm sure you've all seen these fins, more fun style fins or retro fins. So you can play around with different angles on your board, but you can't actually change the boxes themselves. Yep. For example, at Leo Carrillo, the waves are quite steep on the shore break, and they are closeouts. I'd ride both fins because, or both styles of fins, because you can draw different lines on the face of the wave. However, most of the time I would ride a thruster fin setup because it's more predictable. A lot of the time, if you're using the quad fin setup, it might be, say, for example, every 5 turns that you do, you might have 1 to 2 amazing ones, but then 3 of them you might fall off because it was too unpredictable. Whereas every 5 turns that I do with the thruster fin setup, maybe 4 of them turn out really well, you know, because of the predictability factor.
So
Yep. At the gorge, typically onshore conditions, slopey flat waves, I'd be looking more at a quad fin setup. Yep. So I can really lock in. And then also too, when you're riding along in onshore conditions, you're riding along the wave, it gives you 2 fins to work with and really sort of lock in. And I find too, like I said earlier, with the quad fin setup, when it is smaller, flatter, mushier waves, for me it feels like they draw more fun, different lines. You know, so I surf a different part of the wave and it gets me a little bit more excited than the predictability of the standard thruster fin setup. So in terms of how to pick the right size fin for you, first thing you need to remember, the more fins that you have or the bigger fins that you have, the more drag you're going to create in the water. However, the bigger fins that you have, the more you can lock in your rail, especially if you're a bigger person. So typically the formula is, the bigger you are, the bigger your fins are going to be. The smaller you are, the smaller your fins are going to be. I pretty much ride a medium-sized fin most of the time. Strong wind, big fins, you're going to create more drag. Okay, so it's really ultimately what you're trying to achieve in light wind is something that's going to create more lift to get you up and going more. So what is going to create more lift? Some bigger fins. Yeah. Yeah, that's all we're just talking about. I have a set of fins in my back pocket. When I boost in air, I just change them. You haven't seen that? Yeah. Without you know, trying to plug the fins too much that we use, this system here, as far as I'm concerned, which is the FCS2 fin system, you could never use anything else after you've used it. I'll show you why. Pull straight out, click straight back in. For me, that is simplicity. I can change fins in 2 seconds. Whereas this fin system, which is the old FCS fin system, you've got little screws that screw the fins in. So you need an extra tool, which is the key. The tools strip really easily. It takes 5 minutes longer to change the fins on that board than what it does on this board. Yeah, I mean, I've been using these fins for 6 months now, and I haven't had an issue with them personally. And yeah, so like I said, I haven't really heard of much stuff that's gone wrong with them. But you know, it's you know, high-tech stuff. There's always going to be things that go wrong with you know, any type of production. But I have a lot of issues with these fins as well. You know, where you strip the screws or they don't fit in correctly. You know, so just overall, I'm saying if you've got the opportunity, try the FCS2 fins. Yeah, so for me, I have a million boards at home, right? I try everything and I'm always testing and trying new design or whatever. But I just recommend for people, just average riders, they only need 2 boards. One board that's going to be good in flat, mushy conditions and light wind that you can get out and go on and have fun on any time, which you're probably going to ride 80% of the time. Then your other board is going to be more of a performance board. So if you come somewhere like here and like it was on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, I mean, that's as good as conditions as you're going to get anywhere. You want to have a board that's going to work well in those conditions. You might only use that board a handful of times a year, but you've got it there, it's ready to roll. the main board you're going to use is something like this. It's going to be a fun shape that you can use in just about all conditions. So Blair's asking, how do you direct a shaper to make a board specifically for what you want? And what I'm saying is, the beautiful thing about a surfboard shaper is they know what works, they know what they're talking about. So all you need to give this shaper is the details of your weight, your height, and the specific conditions that you're trying to ride in, or that you want to ride this board in, okay? So in terms of like what you're saying for your typical location, all you need to say, you need to just give him your measurements so he knows what he's dealing with. And I'm riding in 2 to 4 foot of weight, 2 to 4 foot height in the waves, pretty light wind. So I want something with not too much rocker. I want a medium rocker, so it's not too flat. And then I want plenty of area up by my front foot, so it's not too narrow, because I'm not going in a fast straight line. I want to be able to do some nice turns on the wave. And overall, I'd be focusing more on, I want, like a semi-fun shape, a hybrid board. I don't want a full fish style board. I just want something that sits right in the middle. And that's what would be working perfectly for your conditions. Short board, you have full control. Fish, you're out of control a lot of the time. Okay, you can't do steep critical turns on a steep part of the wave. Okay, the fish board's not going to fit in there because it's got a flat rocker. Okay, and it's wider and might have quad fins. So you're gonna have less control. Whereas a short board in really small junky waves, you're never going to get up enough speed to get it going. But a fish board, you'll get up and get going straight away because it's got that nice flat rocker. Yeah. So what I'm talking about with the hybrid is something that sits right in the middle. So you can still ride it in the junky conditions, but you can take it out when it's still good as well. Thanks for signing up. I hope you got some really great tips. However, if you think we've missed anything, please feel free to contact us anytime. We're always more than happy to help out.